So what's the definition or meaning of prober? Dictionary definition of probe. It's really penetration, to investigate or explore something that is hidden from sight or knowledge. I am able to hear them. Can you ask them to? So probing is really to seek or question, right? It's also about seeing close. It's also about seeing far. It's also about going deep. It's really being unbounded and limitless. So when we say probing, we are trying to expand ourselves really, right? Now, what are we really probing as in our profession, in what we do? Are we probing the system under test, the product that we have built, the application that we have developed? Or are we looking at it from the perspective and probing from the view of the various consumers, the end users who interact with the system under test? Do we also realize that the system under test is not just our code, but it probably has other pieces of code as components and it interacts with other systems? So are we probing those interactions of stuff that we have as part of our system, and therefore the perturbation that is caused by the components inside? And also the things that we interact with, external systems maybe, and the perturbation that is up there, are we probing them? Or are we looking at it from a probe from the people, from the producer standpoint, as a producer, as a developer, as a company which produces the system, which is really the system under test? Do I probe by keeping in viewpoints of from the perspective of the engineering manager, from the perspective of product marketing and management, from the perspective of the financial guys and so on? And therefore, what are we probing? Whose points of view? Is it the product? Is it the consumers? Is it the pieces that form a part? Is it the other systems that it integrates with? And is it from the producer? So probing really in this entire context, I want just at the context that it is highly multidimensional. That's what we're doing today, right? And testing is really deep probing. It's not anymore just validation. As I go back now to my webcast and then take a little more deeper look as to what it means and ask, what is smart probing after all? I kind of see it as two parts. It consists of kind of designing smart probes on one side. And then, of course, the second part is about the act of doing the probing smartly, right? And what do smart probes really mean? What does it dependent on? And that's where I think the outcome of the poll could be of use here. That is, the act of designing smart probes probably requires good techniques, a very left brain activity. Whereas the act of probing smartly is probably via great practices, more often individual in nature, and therefore it's via great practices. So what are probes? Probe seems to indicate something that we perturb the system with. Maybe looks like a scenario, looks like a test case, looks like a test step. Is it what it is? In a simple way to think about it, it seems that's true. But let's expand upon that idea of smart probes. So smart probes are not necessarily pointed test cases, for example, which is where you see the last piece that's up there. It could also be certain kind of checklist or smart checks, which are not closed-ended. They are idea-oriented. They help you think. So they are not exactly pointed scenarios. So it's a little more generic notion of test scenarios. Is that all smart probes all about? Not necessarily. It could also be things like questions or observations or suggestions that you might have. And they may be driven by certain criteria, issues, conditions that are there as a part of the system and the larger context of the system. Because remember, we are actually testing a system of systems. So when you say smart probes, it is not as sharp and pointed like a test case. it really is a larger context. And I think we appreciate that if we come from an exploratory style of thinking. Now, if this is what we are going to evaluate with the smart probes, how do we do that? What does it take to conduct the activity of probing smartly? And that's really an individual practice that's really dependent on the individual habits that we have built over time. And some of the habits that I've listed down very briefly is to think in terms of short sessions so that I can be very immersive. I can be focused. And at the same time, I can actually meander. And we can think of sessions as starting from the top, reconnaissance, at taking the bigger look, the larger look, the higher order look, and the exploration and the deep dive, which is really about going deeper, and finally about coming back and then reflecting on what we did, which is recoup. So think of it like a scuba diver, right? I look at the expansive ocean, I go down all the way deep, and then I can't sit there for too long a time. And then I come back up, and then I take in my lungful of air and recoup, and then go back on the next dive. And that's really a session-based approach. So probing smartly is more often driven by activities, and that's why I think the way we do our activities, and that's why it's kind of a right brain activity, right? So in a way, if I had to put it in a quick pictorial form, I think probe allows us to do a lot of these things. Probe to spark ideas, to spot issues, to observe deeply, to discern criteria, to come up with suggestions. But finally, the whole objective is driven by the central idea of seeking clarity. And that's really what we're trying to do when we have this mentality or the mindset of probing. Right? Question? So if you really look, if I go back and ask, I hope you remember what we just talked about, right? We talked about the fact that the smart probes, and we're really reiterating that in that sense. Is it scenarios only? Or is it smarter checklists that we come up with? Or is it much beyond that? What do you think are some of the answers? These are not necessarily conclusive, complete answers, just ideas that we're exploring, right? So is it pointed scenarios, or is open-ended smart checklists, or is it much more open-ended questions and suggestions and observations and so on and so forth, right? And that's really what it is. So the whole idea of the whole mindset of probing and the whole act of probing, the idea is to really become a little more limitless, to be much more expansive, still be logical, still be aided by tools, but exploit the intellect to do a job hopefully far better, efficient, effective, and so on, right? So let's take a look at what people said, and that's what the answer looks like. And again, it's a multi-choice question, right? I think a lot of you said it's about questions and suggestions and so on, which is great. So let's try to get in the last section. What are the benefits? And I'm not going to sit down and write on all the benefits, but I think you get the idea that, it's probably interesting to look at this idea. One of the benefits is we might more often, when we look at testing, sometimes we feel fatigued by the rote act of doing. And when you kind of probe, we're probably trying to go beyond the mundane, to be more joyous, as kind of the picture puts in place. Sometimes the act of validation is more often by, oh my gosh, I've got to do a lot more. We're troubled to do more and more and more. And that's kind of hard, right? Whereas when you think about it from a probe perspective, or a probing mindset and the act, it's more often you're trying to do less, yet accomplish more, right? So we kind of unravel the do more spaghetti into something more interesting with a bulb inside, right? If I didn't have a well-formed probing mindset, I'm more often seen like bounded. I'm looking at it from specification, product, technology, and stuff like that. And sometimes I might be kind of in a boxed notion. So it's important to see if you can break free. So one of the big benefits is being the ability to break free from being bounded to becoming limitless. And that's probably one of the finest benefits of having a probing mindset and being able to probe itself. We collect metrics, we put charts, we send reports. As my colleague says, it's vanity metrics. But what we really need from a business context is to make superior decisions. And therefore, probing allows us to go beyond just numbers It allows us to make far more deeper decisions, which ultimately add value. What does it ultimately do? It helps us shift left. And that is probably what all of us want to do, to be able to preempt, to be able to prevent, and so on and so on, right? So in conclusion, probing is beyond the typical test that we most often are engaged with. It is truly engrossing. It's intelligent. It is fun. It is absolutely joyous. It's really a brilliant experience. So I don't know how many people would think of testing as a joyous and a fun experience. I think very few people would probably think of it that way. I think all of us would think of it as possibly an activity that I have to do in a terribly constrained time. But I wanted to kind of, as a part of the Smart Musings, take a slightly different look and just throw in some interesting ideas from looking at it from the word of probing, and then kind of throwing in some ideas as to how it is useful, what it needs to change, and how we might benefit from the entire piece. Thank you for being here.